Commissioner Stupka. We have a quorum.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kayla. So are there any modifications to the consent agenda? I'm not seeing any hands. So is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented? I see Commissioner Hadamaki, and was that Commissioner Parsons second? Can you be second? Okay, great. So all those in favor of the motion, what we're going to do is physically raise hands and give me a minute to sort of scan. So all those in favor, physically raise your hand. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the consent agenda passes. Next up, we're going to move to public comment. So this is an opportunity for people to speak for up to 3 minutes. Please call 206-337-9723 and enter meeting ID number 915-9624-1857. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand one by one using the last 3 digits of your phone number. In order to electronically raise your hand, to indicate your desire to speak, please press *9 on your phone. You will hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. When speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute any television or background sounds. State your name at the beginning of your comments. Kayla, do we have anyone waiting to make a comment today?
Yes, we do.
Great.
So we have phone number 814 who has raised their hand to speak. So 814, I have allowed you to speak. You will press *9 to unmute yourself.
I think it's star 6 to unmute.
*9 to raise your hand and *6. You're right, Molly.
Yeah.
All right,
Hello?
You're unmuted now. You can go ahead and speak, and you'll have 3 minutes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, this is Clark Chernesky. I just want to say good evening to you. And I just learned in the listing of project status for tonight's meeting that the sidewalk gap on Traver and Nixon Road is going to be postponed till 2022. Now, this is a project that had been postponed earlier for the last couple of years because of design work for the Nixon Corridor project. And it looked like things were going to go nicely in the spring, and then it got postponed, and then had the sidewalk millage. And anyway, it looks like it'll be 2022. And there is a need for some activity that will make things safer, mainly a crosswalk between Duveron Road roundabout and the Traver Road Clay School crossing. That's a distance of 2,000 feet. And so there's no crosswalk between that. I had written an email to the commission in July proposing a crosswalk on the north edge of Westbury Court and Nixon Road. There's a street light on the west side. A new street light would have to be installed on the east side of Nixon Road, but there's a conduit for street lights right there. And this would mean that people living in the southwest part of the development there would not have to walk 1,000 feet north and then 1,000 feet south in order to safely cross the road. There aren't even any warning signs about pedestrians in the area, and there's a Ann Arbor Transportation Authority stop on each side of Nixon Road. So we'd like to, in the earliest possible in the construction season, to please put in a crosswalk there. I think it would really be needed. And one other thing is I was virtually at the meeting having to do with the proposed under the railroad track tunnel at North Main Street, M14, the entrance to Bandimere Park, and it was beautifully handled. The person from the city and the person from the county did an excellent presentation, and they really did their homework. So I would like to see that project go forward as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Are there any other people waiting to make a comment?
There are none.
Okay, so as we have done in the past, because it can sometimes take a little while to call in, if we get other commenters calling in, we will turn to public comment in order to allow everyone a chance to speak. So now we're going to move on to information and discussion. And we now invite civil engineer Luke Liu and project consultant Steve Loveland to provide an update on the Lower Town mobility study.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good evening. I'm Steve Loveland with OHM Advisors. I am the project manager for the Lower Town Area Mobility Study. And I'm here tonight to give you an update on the study and what we've done to date. First off, why are we doing a mobility study? A couple reasons. We want to get a holistic view of transportation conditions in the Lower Town area. We want to look at all travelers in the area. And our overall goal is to make traveling around the Lower Town area easier, safer, and more efficient. I'm going to give a quick presentation, around 10 minutes or so, and then we'll follow that up with questions. So what we're studying, you can see on the right, the outline is the Lower Town area that we're looking at. The purpose is to identify opportunities to make traveling easier, specifically looking at traffic, bicycles, pedestrians, public transit, safety, and intersections. Here's a couple of the major areas. So study process, we started back in September of 2019, and this is a 2-year study. We're just a little bit past halfway. We've mainly been focusing on public engagement and existing conditions analysis so far. We recently had a meeting with the city to discuss vision and goals, also alternatives, and we just had our public meeting number 2 that went through what we've done to date and also talked about vision, goals, and alternatives. So the outcomes of the study we're looking to identify ways to improve mobility for all users, look for opportunities to change travel habits, and come up with some innovative solutions that improve the efficiency of the system. So I'm going to hit on each of the different things that we've worked on to date. So public engagement, we started off the study, and right off the bat, we got into stakeholder interviews. We wanted to find out what the key stakeholders were seeing in the area, what their biggest concerns were. And you can see on this graphic some of the ones that we met with. We also, throughout the project, are going to have 4 public meetings, which we've already had 2. And then leading up to this past public meeting, we held what we called virtual office hours. And these were held on Fridays at noon. And every other Friday we had a topic, and we invited the public to come. And we gave a short presentation, and then we basically just wanted to hear what the public had to say. So what we've heard coming out of stakeholder interviews, their concerns included gaps in the sidewalk, few businesses that are walkable in the area, a growing population, peak hour congestion from commuters, inadequate public transit frequency, traffic safety. So the vehicular traffic is discouraging walking and biking. The new development parking is inadequate, and there's limited crossings of the Huron River. Coming out of the virtual office hours that were held over the last couple of months, some more of what we heard. Specific areas need safety improvements. Residents don't feel comfortable walking and biking. Transit is not frequent enough. There's heavy traffic coming off of M14. The bike infrastructure is disconnected. Safety concerns around the A2 STEAM school. New development's going to be adding more traffic, and then safety conflicts between peds and bikes. So there were some opportunities that have been brought up, and some of them include more frequency and more visibility to transit, improve the walking connection to the hospital, easier access to the border-to-border trail, add more mixed-use retail to the new developments, clearing the snow for the bikes and the pedestrians, add safe crossing infrastructure, work on a culture shift to get more walking and biking rather than vehicular, and then educate the public on safely using the streets. So we looked at traffic conditions, and this was vehicular. What we did is we did traffic counts at key intersections throughout the whole area. We also looked at origin destination, picking the outer points and then a central point to see where traffic was coming from and going to. So from the traffic counts, we built a traffic model which included the signals and all the key intersections that were counted. And what the model allowed us to do was to look and see if there were any high congestion intersections. Based on the model, we were seeing some vehicular delays at the yellow dots here, which are Plymouth at Barton, 23 or M14 off-ramp to Barton, Barton at the on-ramp, Duvarden at Pontiac Trail, and Division at Catherine. Although the models didn't show great delays, we based, the red dots were just based on observation when we've been out in the field, Barton at Pontiac Trail, Maiden Lane at Broadway, and then Maiden at Fuller. So what the origin destination told us is that the majority of the traffic in Lower Town are vehicles that are coming from outside of the area, traveling through and going to somewhere else outside of the area. So 55% just pass through. 21% come from Lower Town and then go to somewhere else in Ann Arbor. 20% are traveling from Lower Town to districts outside, and only 4% of the trips were all stayed inside Lower Town. Then we also put a big focus on the pedestrian and bike infrastructure that's out there. And this is just a graphic that shows the tool that was decided to be used. It is a tool created by the San Francisco Department of Public Health, and they have one for both pedestrians and bikes. And what that involved is we sent teams of people out into the field, and we inventoried all the roads, all the intersections, and the input categories are listed here. The items listed to the right are just a couple examples of each, but there were like 2 pages of information to fill out on each segment or intersection. Once we inventoried all of the ped and bike information, we were able to put it into a spreadsheet, and then it spit out a score. So you can see here 41 to 60, the yellow is that basic ped and bike conditions exist. As you get into the green, that's the most ideal situation, and then the red is unsuitable. There's various items that contribute to making something more ideal. Say at an intersection, if you had pedestrian crossings on all legs, if you had multiple lights out there, it's just varying things that make your score go up or down. So graphics that can be spit out of doing that work show, this one is for pedestrians, and there's 2 of them here because they're for different sides of the street. Most of this is yellow, which is basic pedestrian conditions exist. The red gives us information to where we may need to focus more for the study. And then similar graphics are created for the bicycles. You can see the north-south along Pontiac Trail is green, and I believe this is probably because there's bike facilities along there. And we only had one area of red, and that's an unpaved road. So for safety, there was a number of things that we've done so far throughout the study. The first of which was a crash analysis, where we looked at 5 years of data. We found 479 crashes in the study area, with over half of them at the 3 major intersections. That would be Broadway at Maiden, Fuller at Maiden, and then Division at Beeks and Broadway. We found 14 ped or bike crashes. And then coming out of the crash analysis, we had some recommendations. Some of those included adding paved shoulders, potential locations for roundabouts, other alternative intersection configurations. Another step of the study, we looked at uncontrolled pedestrian crossings. So what an uncontrolled pedestrian crossing consisted of were locations that did not already have a traffic signal, or they were not to neighborhood streets crossing. And there were 31 of these that we evaluated. Almost all of them met the guidance out of NCHRP 562, which is improving pedestrian safety at unsignalized crossings. And that's what the city follows when looking at their pedestrian crossing locations. I think there was only one location that needed to be upgraded. And then we ended up finding 4 new locations where we're recommending pedestrian crossings. Early on in the study, we did a road safety audit of the entire Lower Town area. We had at least 4 people out in the field. We looked at every road, every intersection, and we came up with a number of different recommendations, both short-term and long-term recommendations. And the main categories that came out of that were pedestrian infrastructure, speed management, traffic congestion, bicycle infrastructure, pavement conditions, and traffic control devices. I'll get into a couple of the recommendations that came out of that in some of the upcoming slides. Our latest step in the study, as I said, was the vision, goals, and alternatives workshop that we had with the city. And then that was also a part of the most recent public meeting. What we ultimately decided through this process that was we were going to follow along with the city's comprehensive transportation plan that is in draft form at the moment. And the mobility values are listed on this page. And those are also going to be the values that we use for this study: safety, mobility, accessibility for all, healthy people and sustainable places, and regional connectivity. So some alternatives. We're still working through this process of compiling all the alternatives, but we've had some good ideas brought to the table. Coming out of the road safety audit, here's just a few. I think we had over an hour long, maybe an hour and a half long presentation of all the alternatives and findings, but here's just a few. Some of them are intersection changes, lighting upgrades, non-motorized infrastructure, transit improvements, speed management, and ADA access. So this first picture here just shows where there's a gap in existing sidewalk. And this is just showing how you could potentially fill in the gap. Some of these here, the upper left, people using the Cascades in the summer sometimes will park south and east of Broadway and then cross Broadway. This was looking at ways to improve to allow more time for pedestrians to cross there. Upper middle was long-term possibility of reconfiguring the Maiden Wall Street area. Lower left is Pontiac Trail at Moore Street. We looked at a bunch of different options there to improve that, and the same intersection is on the lower right with a potential roundabout. The bottom center picture is just an area where there's a bus stop and they allow parking, so we were pointed that out. And then the upper right is where we saw a dirt path, or the grass was wore down, so it was a dirt path. And wherever we found areas like that, we thought about paving or improving the area. Another topic of the study is transportation demand management. There's been a lot of discussion about, do we need more parking rides? Is what's there available? Are there other locations around the city or outside of the city where it would make sense to park traffic and bring it in? This lists out some of the other strategies: flexible work times, ride sharing, improving public transit. And then some ideas that have come out of the office hours that we've held, improvement ideas from the community, adding rectangular rapid flashing beacons along Pontiac Trail, speed management, border to border trail connections, green bike lane paint, driver and pedestrian safety education, and then park and ride locations. So this is wrapping it up. Our next steps of the study, we're going to consolidate and refine our alternatives. We're actually working on that now. Then we will do some analysis and evaluation of alternatives. Public meeting 3, we will present alternatives. And then between public meeting and public meeting number 4, we will prepare the report and then come back at the very end with overall findings and recommendations. So if there are questions, I am done with the presentation.
Thank you very much. So if we can end screen sharing so that I can see raised hands, I'll ask if you have questions to physically raise your hand, and I'll call on people. Questions or comments? Councilmember Briggs.
Thank you. That was great presentation. Exciting to see where we're at right now. Just a few questions. I may have more later. I was surprised a little bit that one of the highest scoring locations for ped and bike safety, I believe, was along Plymouth. And I assumed that was a little bit because of there's a continuous bike lane along there and there's a side path, and so that the area might have been ranked, may have ended up getting ranked higher. But the width of the roadway there and the speeds along it present a relatively treacherous environment. I think that's probably where we've seen I suspect where a lot of our crash data is for that corridor. But I didn't see anything about recommendations around addressing speeds or roadway configuration in that area, and I was yet in the recommendations. I was curious if that was something that had been contemplated, or any thoughts on that.
Okay, yeah, what you pointed out has been brought up in discussions. One of the figures shows green, and that's the side that path is on, even though it's not technically a bike path when it was coded in the field notes. It was noted as a separate facility off of the road. that bikes could use. And I think that's why the one side of the street scored well. And then the other was yellow, which was basic bicyclist conditions. We also do have noted in our list of alternatives about improvements along that stretch of road from Barton down into the heart of Lower Town as potential areas to improve for bikes. I know, pretty sure there's a project in the works or already in the works that improves that as well. But yes, that is a part of it.
I have a question that actually builds on that. I'm curious about the way was it the BEQI, that index, where that maps to the idea of like a low stress or an all ages bike network, which is what's sort of laid out in the goal of the transportation plan. Like, because I also was surprised by some of those ratings, and I wonder, it didn't really seem like green was what we would call low stress. And I'm wondering if those map to each other at all, or if we might be able to do a sort of different standard to assess those to see if we get different results.
Also, something we've talked about is you can adjust scoring to fit your own community and how you view certain things. And we have talked about that. We actually have a sub-consultant on our team that was leading that. So I am not the actual lead on that, but that's a good question and something that we can look more into.
Yeah, just to add on to that, we thought about using the level of stress versus this, and given the scale of the study area and the number of intersections and segments we'll be working on, we thought having a metric that's going to provide us with a greater level of detail for comparison. And when we do the scoring coming out of the first round of result, it was a little surprising to see most signalized intersections have a better rating than those that are not. And sometimes those does not directly correlate to user experience. And that's, I think, just the nature of how the score is rated. We understand that, and we're keeping that in mind. So we're not truly treating all the dark green as great. So it's more or less as a reminder for us to go through the list and really comb through, see what items we could consider for improvement.
It's really helpful. Thanks. Yeah, I know Councilmember Briggs, I know you had more questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just have a couple more for right now. One is broad, and then one's kind of specific. I'm trying to figure out which direction to go. I'll start with the more specific one and then end with the other one. I guess I just got off of Planning Commission, and having dealt with a lot of the development projects that have come in on Pontiac Trail, I'm very cognizant of sort of the recommendations that came out of those traffic studies for addressing concerns and how to mitigate the extra traffic. And I guess I would hope that part of the recommendations that might come out of this would also be recommendations about how we might need to consider changes either within our traffic study review process or different elements that we're asking for. Like, there's not too many huge pieces of land still available, but there is one or two up that way still. Around how we might be dealing with improving transit along that corridor. I think we're obviously not going to widen Pontiac Trail, I hope. So we're dealing with limited right of way there. Recommendations around improving transit efficiency along that corridor, I think, will be really important, as well as bike and ped. So that's, I guess, maybe just a comment that maybe you can address in a second. But more broadly, the goal of this is to, as you said at the beginning, was to make travel easier, safer, and more efficient, which are all great terms individually. But I think we're all pretty cognizant that there's tensions between those, especially in terms of how efficiency for one mode. Often automobiles may create challenges for the safety of other users. And so I was hoping, I guess, a little bit of how that's being prioritized or thought of within the context of this study about the recommendations that get that come out of it. Is it all coming through the lens of the sort of the our Vision Zero transportation goals, or I guess that.
Well, let me just answer that last part about the different competing modes and how we're going to say making traffic flow better. That's going to hurt the ped and bikes. Or so what we have is we have a huge list of all different options or different alternatives. They can be small, from like filling in a sidewalk gap to reconfiguring the whole area. But what we want to do is we're gonna have to, which we don't have in place yet, but we're gonna have, and we've been talking about this, is come up with a way that says, okay, this alternative is this. It's good for peds, it's good for bikes, but it's bad for traffic. You know, have some sort of table or something with the alternatives that say, yes, it checks all the boxes, or no, it's only good for bikes, or, you know, and then ultimately this is a planning study, and we're not saying you have to do all these things. It's going to be someone else who ultimately does that. It's just, we're going to have all the different tools available. Is that good on that question? Okay, and then the review process for new developments. I know throughout this process, it has been brought up about new developments. No, we're not planning to widen Pontiac Trail. What specifically are you looking to change in the review process, or I guess what are the biggest issues?
I guess I'm not looking for anything specifically at this moment. I'm just curious if that is, in terms of thinking about the recommendations that might come out of this process, if it might have implications on that process, and specifically some of the elements that we might, it might push us to ask for, I guess, different elements to mitigate some of the impacts of development along that area. Just a heads up that I wonder if there are opportunities to improve that process so that when developments are going to have a sizable impact along that corridor, or actually, quite honestly, any place in the city. I think it's just it's an area that's been particularly impacted recently. Just the way that we mitigate around it. Historically, we're moving away from this, but I think historically we've thought a lot about the impact on automotive motorized traffic. So travel.
Luke, do you remember any of the specifics that we had talked about?
Yeah, I was gonna provide some additional follow-up here. That's very insightful comment. Actually, that's something we're already feeling as we're threading different steps between conducting the Lower Town mobility study and at the same time conducting development site plan reviews. Just as of last few weeks, we are reorganizing the sequence of some intersection alternative designs at the intersection at Duval, because we know this is going to be part of the alternative analysis for the study, and there's a petition that will potentially have impact to the intersection. So it's at the same time addressing both directions will give us some opportunity to solve potential conflicts and make sure, I guess, future development at the intersection or nearby will be compatible to potential recommendations from this study. So that's something we're already working on, and OHM has been cooperating and very supportive of producing a preliminary layout for a roundabout at that intersection, as that also ties into potential alternatives as how we can change the corridor along Pontiac Trail to address the speed concern. And for, I guess, other another perspective of the study is, as Steve mentioned, we took a look into the origin destination of users using the lower town study area. Because it's one of our hypotheses that the congestion our residents feel in the study area may not actually be caused by local needs. So, but before we go too far, we want to really have a good understanding as to what are the contributing factors to congestion. Because very often in an engineering study, we're looking to having mitigation measures at the same spot or nearby the congestion location. The advantage of having a planning study is to really understand where are the origins of these trips. So the actual solution or recommendation may be outside of the study area. We want to really take on this opportunity to understand it and addressing properly.
Thank you.
Commissioner Summers.
This is one of a question of curiosity, I guess, more than anything else. So you guys taking using data from people that are using the infrastructure. Do the engineers actually go out and use the infrastructure? Do you ride the bike lanes at different times of the day? Do you walk the walking path at different times of the day to get like firsthand experience of what's going on? Do any of the engineers actually do that?
Yeah, when we were out for the road safety audit, which was pre-pandemic, we were out there for 3 full days in the field. We were also out there when it was dark at night. We walked it, we drove it. Now, we did not bike it. That question's come up a few times when we're meeting with the public. They like to ask if we rode the bikes out there and if we felt safe. And that's one thing we've not done.
Okay. That's something that you may do in the future?
And that was not part of our scope, and I don't know. I don't have a bike to bring up there, I don't think. I don't have a way to get my bike up there.
Okay.
I don't think we're against the idea. When we get a question, often it leads to a full array of suggestions or things that even when we're out there on foot that we may have missed. Some things came up even for the green paint. There's a very avid user actually told us any wet condition, rain or foggy or snow, the user actually avoids using the area. So that's something we're going to follow up internally as to the selection of material and really maybe checking on like at that spot the performance of those surface under wet condition. So that's just like one example. Something else just came up during the ongoing online survey these days along Broadway Bridge. We actually have several structures overpassing the river and railroad tracks. The expansion joints on those bridges on the sidewalk, that's actually a pretty smooth metal surface. And that's something we did not, even when we walked there, we did not notice that. So, thank you for this input. Now we do know it. And we went back and compared with some other, like more recent bridges, like the one on Fuller Road. And those are the ones that actually have some texture on it to be anti-slip during wet condition. That's something we're following up, and the bridge engineer has provided input internal to us that the next year, when the bridge is along Broadway, we'll go through rehabilitation. Those surfaces will be coated.
Okay, so that brings up a concern that I didn't even think about. I had thought that the green paint and whatnot would have already been considered for things like that. It is a pretty common biking method to avoid any paint that's on the road, almost in any condition, even on a hot day. If you're riding on the white bike lane paint, your tires can slip on that. So any paint that goes on the road in mixed conditions, mixed mobility like this should be considered for, bike safety, not just like what goes in the bike lane. Just my opinion.
Right. Yep. I believe that's something staff, when the green paint was put down, it was already considered, but somehow I guess it was a feedback. The performance was not up to what the user expected. So that's something we're going to follow up and see really what can we do to improve the performance.
Commissioner Parsons, I think I saw your hand earlier. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, thank you. A question first, some comments, maybe a comment after the question. I don't know. Really quick, I need to pick up on how we assign these grades and levels to bicycle infrastructure in the green. That's already been addressed plenty. I need to just log my complaint that no one rode a bicycle through this corridor to assess what it felt like. Is it just that easy to get in a car or that easy to walk on the street, but it's not that easy to go on a bike to assess things, which I think speaks a lot to the character of how things get represented by green or 90% or quote unquote ideal for bicycle infrastructure. It seems like we need to develop this more, and that's true of a lot of studies that come through, including our current Vision Zero plan. What does it feel like to go through these corridors? Anyway, I had to get that off my chest. We can let that go. I don't even need a response. It's just that's out there. I had a sort of wonky question that I find really interesting, and so curious about how you came across the data that you did. If I remember right, 55% of people going through the corridor go through the corridor just to go through it.
Correct.
So that seems correct. And then the other thing is that only 4% of people remain in the area, and then the others are commuters. Okay, and it's really interesting to hear that in that study we also want more transit and more retail, so people actually want to stay in that area as opposed to go through it. At least that's the balance that we need to find, right? So for me, that 55% seems a really high number. So I'm curious to hear, how do you guys come to that data? What does it take? Can we do it in other corridors fairly easily? I know this was a pretty robust study that you all did. Could the city, for instance, apply this to neighborhood streets? The wonky stuff is kind of what I want to hear from you.
To do that study, we had video data, or no, it was, I think it picks up by phones, and it picks up about 20% of people that go by it. So what we did is we had out by M14, we had one out there. We had one up at Duvar and Pontiac Trail. We had one out at Barton and Plymouth. You know, all the major entry and exit points of the area. And then we also had one at the Maiden Lane Broadway intersection. So it collected all this data at the same time. And then you could see if it hit one point and it hit the next point and it hit the next point. And we had a sub-consultant that did our data collection. For our traffic counts, it was all video data collection, and then it processes it and puts it into the normal format that we use. And then he also did the origin destination stuff.
That is fascinating, and I wouldn't mind a contact so I could talk to you more about that stuff, because I think it's really important.
When we actually started going through this process, knowing that Luke wanted to do something like that, he did send over flyers that describe how it works. So I can probably get that to you.
I think that's really useful. And then to dive a little bit deeper, because I think it's important for the commission and the public. When you guys were looking at the figures on people that were leaving Lower Town versus coming to Lower Town, which is the other like 40%, did you do that study like in the morning, presuming people were commuting one way or the other, or, you know, like, 'cause it seems like time is such a factor when it comes to that question.
We had information for the whole day, wasn't it, Luke?
Yes, we collected data for the whole day. I guess those percentages right now, as we were looking at them, it does not break down to any particular corridor in the area. It is looking at the area as a whole, and it is in combination of the OD data collected from field, and also the travel demand modeling from SEMCOG. So we ran the regional planning model and couple that with the data to validate the numbers along Pontiac Trail to get that result. And so for the next steps of the study, when we are going to look at a particular intersection or a particular approach to an intersection like Barton Drive at Pontiac Trail, we'll need to rerun those models to drill down to understand during the morning peak. We know there's typically before pandemic, there's a big queue on eastbound Barton approaching Pontiac Trail. So we can really relate that observation with the modeling analysis to understand where those users are from. Are they from Washington County? Are they from even Livingston County? We don't really know. So only after those analyses, we will be able to really have some numbers to support our alternatives.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you all. Final thing to say, and this is more of a comment or a recommendation for the overall report. I don't know if it's in there because I haven't seen the report, and I know you're still working on it. But it seems like there's a lot of things that could use a little bit more study. You know, these are just problem areas. Let's figure this out. So any language that we could include, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes, that include recommending further staff study and funding to figure out potential solutions to the underlying problem that's been found in the study. For me personally, I think that would go a long way to addressing these in a timely fashion as we move forward. But thank you for the answers to my specific questions as well as your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Valderrama.
Well, thank you for presenting. And so when I was reading the stakeholder interviews, some of the things that stood out to me were, of course, like safety as a priority, and how there was a few goals that stood out to me, which were speed reduction, sidewalk connections, and a bike infrastructure. I actually lived in Lower Town, so I would actually use that regularly to like bike through. And every single time I was like, I don't know if there's a lot of instances where I came very close to bike accidents. Thankfully, that wasn't the case. But have there been any in your review or your walkthrough or even speaking with people and reviewing the surveys that you found to be like urgent measures that needed to be taken care of like sooner rather than later?
Over the last few office hours that we held, so the Fridays leading up to the last public meeting, we've had one person on that is bikes constantly. He's always biking the area. He's pointed out to us a lot of concerns he has, which have been documented. I don't have those all specifically, and I don't know any one specific one other than what we talked about. He said not to put the green paint if it's going to be like it is on this other corridor that's not outside Lower Town. He had a number of things though, and we've been documenting that through the process. Luke, any specifics that you can think of that came up on biking the area? This guy was on there, and his daughter also was on there. Say.
Right. I guess along the process, a couple locations for bicyclists were pointed out. One is outbound Barton near Pontiac Trail, the transition of bicycle lanes. Another one would be Broadway Bridge inbound near Beeks, where Broadway becomes Beeks. And the same thing for the outbound direction from Division, where the bend is. Those have been identified as challenging areas. Some of those can be addressed in relatively short term, gauging by what's required. Some others, I guess, would require additional coordination as they are related to how the intersection is configured.
We're about at the time that we had set aside for this discussion. I think if there are further questions or comments, we can always communicate those via email through Kayla. And I think we can move on for now. There's nothing more that's really pressing. So, okay. Yes, Kayla.
Just quick update that Commissioner Crawford has joined us, so the attendance will be updated to reflect that Commissioner Crawford is present. Also, we did have a public attendee that was on the call during a portion of the Lower Town discussion. They're no longer in that on the panel there. So if that member of the public is following along, watching on CTN, and you're able to call in again, please do. We would value your feedback, and we'll try to make sure we can get to that more quickly. I was hoping that we could get to the member of the public once the commissioner feedback wraps up. So please try us again. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me see. Next, we invite Commissioners Boland and Felt and Seth Peterson to provide an update and draft recommendations from the 7th Street Process Committee.
Thank you. I'm just going to provide a little background, and then Julie can talk about the progress, but I'm glad that Seth could join us as well. So you have the entire committee here. And it's helpful, I think, because we've got some new commissioners, and also because the scope of this started before the Transportation Commission was established. So that's one of the reasons why we're looking back at it as for learning opportunity. And that was one of the purposes of the committee to begin with, was to learn from the experience. The feedback we have is that the solutions to 7th Street are not working. And so the question was, what went wrong? And also, what do we do about it? And through the process, we've had some great interactions and opportunities to engage with staff and get some interesting questions and background and data from them, which some of which you got in the packet last time. And so we have 2 proposals just to take a quick look at, and then we're hoping on a vote next January, mostly because we had some late staff recommendations and weren't able to incorporate those changes in time for this meeting. But it's a good time to keep you updated and aware of where our thinking is. So I'll just turn it over to Julie, and then Seth, of course, is here to contribute.
Yeah, Seth, feel free to jump in at any point. So 7th Street is an arterial street that cuts across town, but it's very, very heavily residential. It's almost 100% residential. And so it differs in that degree somewhat from other arterial streets that are more of a mix. So they have residential sections and they have sections that are less residential. And so I think that's part of why, well, that and citizen complaints, people who lived along the route were not happy. There were numerous remediations that were tried on 7th Street. So bike lanes were added, I never remember the right word for these, but the pedestrian crossings were enhanced with those little cone type things.
Gateway treatments.
Gateway treatments, thank you. And everything sort of that could be done relatively cheaply was tried. And so we were very disappointed when we looked at the data that was available that there was still a lot of speeding along that corridor. And so part of what we did as a committee was to come up with a set of 5 recommendations. And most of the recommendations are actually broader than just applying to 7th Street specifically, but to apply to streets of that type. So our recommendations are to collect really systematic data for arterial streets so that we can make data-driven recommendations. Along 7th, there's been some data collection, but it's a little sporadic and it's not easy to automate it so that we have consistent data collection. Our second recommendation is to take another look at the quick build paint and post type tools that are available now to see if there are some new treatments that might be helpful on arterial streets. Our third recommendation, consistent with the current overall traffic plan, is to develop a major street calming initiative so that more substantial, expensive treatments could be considered to calm arterial streets. Fourth is to try and get a little bit more creative about our local driver education. So we feel like the education piece has not been fully exploited to where it might be more advantageous. And then finally, to explore the an all ages and abilities bike facility along 7th, which is part of our current current plan that's in draft stage. And that may go a long ways to solving the speeding problem. Seth, do you want to add anything?
You've mostly covered it. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add that the I mean, I feel like the city has done all they can at this point, given the rules regarding arterial streets. And since you can still speed down it, people still speed down it. So, but I mean, it's a citywide issue. But 7th is a good example of a street that we've tried some solutions to improve things, and it has improved things for short periods, but it has come back, especially these days when there's no kids walking to school.
So is this a point at which you wanted questions and feedback, or was this at this point just informational?
I think I can just make a few comments about what happens next. Is that this will be coming back in January for our vote. And so comments or saying, you missed a whole point or whatever would be welcome at this stage so that we can do any redrafting that's necessary before January. The arterial street comment, or the arterial street issue, is that we thought this would apply to places other than 7th. And in the transportation plan, as well as in our proposals, the need for essentially a traffic calming program for arterial streets is what jumped out as being significant. So that may be a concept that's new to most of us as well. Is that, okay, we've got the traffic calming progressing for neighborhoods. How can we begin to wrap our heads around doing it for the rest of the city in a different kind of a way? So I'll just point that out as it's in both of the proposed documents.
Well, I have a question about that then that I think is probably for staff. So my sense from reading these documents and hearing about the 7th Street process is that there are various kinds of limitations on what the city could do on 7th because it's an arterial. And it's not clear to me at what level those limitations are. Are these state regulations based on what we can do on a road, or are these budget limitations? Where I think it would be helpful to understand what the limitations are so we can start to think about how we would address them to create this arterial calming program, which I think is a great idea.
Madam Chair, I can try to address part of that. I think oftentimes the classification of roadway really dictates what funding mechanisms are available to us. So, Act 51 and some of those are only available on major streets, and then we have the road millage that can be used in different areas. So oftentimes that's kind of, matching the right pot of funding with the sort of improvement we want to make. And sometimes that's a challenge depending upon how big the project is. My observation on a road like 7th is probably the biggest limiting factor is just, it's a very constrained corridor, right? I mean, some of the ideas that have been talked about in the past that would, hopefully calm traffic down and make things safer, such as roundabout at 7th and Madison, there just isn't the right of way, right? I mean, short of taking someone's house, which is obviously not popular and not something we would pursue lightly. So, or maybe not even at all. So I think that's been kind of the biggest limiting factor is, we try to squeeze a lot out of a very limited, curb to curb space. And that's, if we're going to widen roadways, and I'm not suggesting we would or should, but, to accommodate bike lanes, well, then tree plots and sidewalks and all of that needs to be shifted. And that starts coming with that big trade-off. And I think that's really the thing that has been the biggest challenge for us. So, as Commissioner Boland mentioned, a lot of the implementation or things that have been implemented have been on the lower hanging fruit side. The in-road signs, the gateway treatments, the small buffer on the bike lane. Those were things we could kind of shoehorn in. What's left are some of the bigger picture items, and those are the ones that are a little bit more challenging, either technically to implement or more costly, and would require just a lot more, support and just effort behind them, and that's why those will be a little longer in the making, I think.
Thank you. That's helpful. Other questions or comments? Commissioner Summers and then Commissioner Hall.
So this may be a little anecdotal, but after just living in the area for a few months and using them quite a bit, I find it very disturbing, especially at night when I'm driving down the road, with there being so much residential activity. It's nearly impossible a lot of times to even see pedestrians in the crosswalk or near the road. I don't know exactly what it is, but if you are moving any faster than about 20 miles per hour, there's a good chance that you're going to run into someone. It has happened to me several times already where people just kind of seem to pop out of nowhere on that road, and there they are, just in the road. So I don't know if lighting can be added to the road, maybe somehow, disincentivizing traffic at all down the road, some kind of bypass on the roads in the area. But I don't have any suggestions. I'm just kind of relaying an experience that I've had over the last few months in using the road.
Commissioner Hall.
Yeah, so I guess the one thing I'm wondering about, this is probably a silly question, but I'm wondering why this has to be a completely separate traffic calming program as opposed to like an amendment to the existing one.
There is no existing arterial traffic calming program.
Well, I know there's no existing arterial traffic calming program, but I'm wondering why it can't be an amendment to the existing traffic calming program.
Yeah, and if I may, Commissioner Hall, I think the mechanism by which we would do a major street traffic calming program, whether it's incorporated into the existing neighborhood traffic calming program or whether it's a standalone separate, I don't think that distinction, at least from a staff perspective, is that important. But I think on a bigger scale, the process that we have for neighborhood traffic calming is not at all applicable to major streets. So I think whether it's amended into the existing traffic calming program or standalone program, we would have to come up with a completely new process because, if you think about, who would have input into that process, who uses that roadway, it's much different on an arterial or a major street compared to a local neighborhood street. And I think those are the sort of, challenges or just not even challenges, but that's just procedurally how we would have to develop a program in that way. But yeah, to your point, we've looked at models. I think Commissioner Parsons was in some of those early traffic calming discussions from a couple of years ago. I think it was a community out west in San Diego, I think it was, that had a comprehensive traffic calming program that applied to majors and local neighborhoods. It could be structured that way, or it could be two separate programs. So I don't think we have a preference, or we haven't even really embarked down that road yet, but both are possible.
Also, the way that we're funding that right now, one little arterial street calming program could gobble up the entire budget for all the traffic calming for all the neighborhoods. There's so little money that's involved at this point, and hopefully that will change with the transportation plan. But these are larger, more expensive projects, is my perception. And there's not much money.
Commissioner Parsons.
I'll try to keep it short for time, but this touches on a lot of things that I've been involved with or interested in for many years on the commission. And first thing is to say thank you so much to the committee that put this together and the thought and care that they put into it. I spent a lot of time out there, and I think you captured it completely. So I really appreciate that effort. The other thing to mention is the idea of looping in arterial traffic calming with neighborhood traffic calming. As a member of that committee that looked at the traffic calming update, it's just two separate things right now. We have to keep those separate. Even cut through traffic needs to be separate. It's okay to keep moving, but we should keep pushing and keep forming committees to make it happen. And so if Commissioner Hull would like to join that committee to look at alternatives to major roads and slowing them down, 100%, we should totally pursue that. One thing that I noticed, and Linda, Diane, maybe we could have a side conversation, is that the recommendations did not entirely fit what some of the observations that were happening according to the notes. And the one that struck me most, and I think it connects to something that Molly was saying earlier about education. There was a communication and education bullet that was in the notes, but I don't think it translated to the proposal at this point. And that's to be more clear on communicating to the public what's happening. And there was I think a note about the stop sign, for instance, at Madison and 7th, specifically as per this report. Like, I think that's really important to figure out how to communicate that really quickly to the public, but also this commission. I would love, as I think Chair Kleinman recommended, some sort of what jurisdictions for what roads and what can we do within those jurisdictions would be really helpful. You know, a primer on that as we think through how we navigate not only this corridor in Ann Arbor, but all the communities that connect us when we talk about townships and all that kind of, like, how do we make that stuff happen? So anyway, positive things. I don't think I need any responses, but thank you all for doing what you do.
Councilmember Briggs.
Yeah, thanks. Great work. I'm excited to hear how this is turning out. I've lived a block away from 7th for most of the last 20 years in a couple of different spots. So I'm pretty familiar with the corridor. I'm pretty familiar with trying to navigate the corridor with kids and kids going to school. And so from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges along that corridor for the speeds and facilities is that it really isn't a corridor that's safe for even high school kids to be able to bike to school safely along. And that's troubling because you're really encouraging them to go on the sidewalk, and yet we know how much risk is there doing that. So this is important, but I think one of the biggest impediments, although this has been resident driven in terms of recognizing the traffic, the speeding issue, is that residents are also the biggest impediment to, quite honestly, to making changes, because it's and I think it points to the need for leading off on any arterial traffic calming program that we might develop, or any solutions with education and outreach, because a lot of the solutions that have been introduced in the past, I know by staff, around parking changes around West Park, have been met with concerns. Gateway treatments are often met with concerns because older drivers often feel them to be a sort of a risk in the roadway. That's something that they might hit. And so I think there's a fair amount of confusion in our community, especially for folks that have been in our community for a long time driving, perhaps about the tools that we're using and what the solutions are. And so I guess my point is just that the education around solutions on arterials is going to be really important to lead with that, I think, to get more community buy-in.
We are about at the time that we scheduled for this. I think since we have another month to until we're actually going to be making a vote, there's some time to get feedback to Commissioner Felt. Do you have a timeline, Commissioner Felt, where like a deadline where you'd like to get feedback by?
I hadn't considered one.
Okay, we can figure that out via email and set a date so that people can get feedback to you in enough time to really incorporate any changes. Okay, great. Thank you so much. This was really this is really helpful. I'm glad that we're sort of tying this all up. It looks great.
Yeah, thanks for coming by, Seth, and we do appreciate the staff support and interactions that we've had as well. I think we've all learned a lot from that.
Great, thank you. So next we invite Kayla Coleman to provide an update on the Glenwood traffic calming process.
Thank you, Chair Kleinman. I'll give a quick overview. So the final plan for the this traffic calming project area was included in your agenda packet. And that plan includes 3 speed tables and 2 raised intersections. The project area is Glenwood Avenue from Overridge Drive to Washtenaw Avenue. And there were 2 public meetings held for this project, which is consistent with the traffic calming program. We did have a modification to hold the meetings electronically due to COVID-19. Sorry. Those meetings were held in August and September. We distributed the final poll to 31 addresses in the project area, and we received, let's see, there were 10 responses received and 7 supported the final plan. So it had a 70% support rate, and the criteria, the threshold for the traffic calming program is 50% support from the responses received. So there was sufficient support to move forward. And we are now here tonight with a draft of the resolution that would be provided to City Council. And the Transportation Commission has the opportunity to take action to make a recommendation to City Council. And the proposed motion language was included in your homework guide for your consideration, that you might consider recommending that City Council approve the resolution to move forward with construction on that project area. And that's the highlights. If there are any questions, I can answer those now before turning it back over to Chair Kleinman to navigate the resolution process.
So I'm seeing no questions and comments. So we're going to move straight to the resolution. So is there a motion to recommend that City Council approve the resolution to approve the installation of traffic calming devices on Glenwood Avenue?
So moved.
Can I get a second? Seconded by Commissioner Felt, or sorry, Boland. Now we have time for any further discussion before we take a vote. Wow, this is gonna be quick. So all those in favor of the motion, please physically raise your hand. All those opposed? And any abstentions? Okay, the motion passes unanimously. Thanks everyone, thanks Kayla.
Okay, thank you.
And now we invite Commissioner Hess to provide an update on Healthy Streets.
Yes, thank you. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Do you see the Healthy Streets pilot project screen or something different?
Yeah, it's like a PDF.
Yes, okay, very good. Before I go into detail on that, I just maybe for especially the new commissioners, a little bit of background on Healthy Streets. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but back in May, City Council passed a resolution which outlined the Healthy Streets approach. It had several different components included in that. The 2 main directives to staff were to establish what we later called neighborhood slow streets. These are the residential soft closures that had a barricade at the entryway to a neighborhood, These were if we received a certain number of petitions from people who live along that street. Those are not included in this report, and part of that was that was not a reporting requirement. Those were the direction we got was to deploy them as quickly as possible based on resident feedback, and that's what we did. There was no baseline data collected aside from the comments that we received from the public. So I just want to clarify if questions come up about the neighborhood slow streets program. I'm happy to answer those, but this report is specific to a reporting requirement on the lane reconfigurations that were done. Again, these were approved by council. They were originally identified in that May resolution, but then ultimately the locations were approved by City Council at their July 6th meeting, I think it was. And part of that approval required us to report back on the data we collected before the deployment and then during the deployment to see what the trends were. So included in your packet is the memo that was provided to City Council last week. It is going into their packet as well for Monday night's meeting, so there might be some additional discussion from City Council at their Monday night meeting. The first thing I want to highlight is this is kind of an executive summary. It's about 7 pages, so it's a fairly short read. It kind of gets to the point. If you really want to geek out on this stuff, there is a 265-page version that has all the background data. I wanted to highlight it. It's right here at the very top of the memo on page 2, or I guess it's page 3 of this packet. So if you really want to do a deep dive and see kind of a lot more, there's a lot more out there. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this memo in detail, but instead what I'd like to do is fast forward to the very last page because I think it's the best snapshot. There's a matrix on the last page that kind of takes all the pilots and puts them into a single spreadsheet. My apologies to those of you following along on screen because it's probably difficult to read, but I'll quickly just kind of highlight it. Again, if you do want to follow along on a bigger screen of your own, you can, if you just go to the agenda item and just scroll to page 7, it shows it there. So ultimately what we did is we tried to, working with the DDA and consultant Smith Group who helped with the data analysis on these, is kind of bucket these in per the deployment and then in different sort of metrics that we gathered information on. So the first was vehicle speeds. I think what's interesting here is we saw vehicle speed reduction in almost all of the deployments. Some are fairly noteworthy, some like on Miller and Catherine where there's a speeding problem or there's an observed speed above the posted speed limit. When the Healthy Streets went in during the deployment, we actually saw that speed limit go down below the speed limit. So that's interesting. And then, you know, you have anywhere between 1 and 5 miles per hour on many of the other locations. East Packard, which if you've ever been down East Packard, it tends to be a fairly fast corridor. Here we saw a 6 to 7 mile per hour speed reduction. So those are notable, especially, you know, those of you that follow Vision Zero and that relationship between speed and fatality or serious crashes and why that's an important consideration. Crashes, for the most part, most of the crash rates we saw trended in a positive direction or were a wash. So we saw less crashes on Miller, Catherine, Division, South Main, and East Packard. And then we saw the same kind of number of crashes we would expect, or not, I shouldn't say expect, because we don't want to expect any, but historical numbers on State, North U, and Packard. Then on crashes that involve bicycles, pedestrians, there were no reported crashes. Now I will make a distinction that on the East Packard, there were 2 crashes that did involve bicyclists and pedestrians, but they were not using the Healthy Streets. We actually went and deep dived into the UD10 report, which is the crash report that's filled out by the reporting police officer. It was someone who was like biking on the sidewalk, for example. So they weren't even in the Healthy Street. So we didn't attribute that to the Healthy Street since that wasn't really the situation at hand. Conflicts and other kind of issues that were observed. You'll see a common thread, and if you were out and about using the healthy streets, I'm sure you came across this yourself. There was some bad behavior that was observed. Loading and deliveries were a common problem, especially in high delivery areas. So, on South Main, for example, just by Madison there, you have those large apartment complexes. The Amazon delivery folks really liked to use that as their personal parking space. You saw a similar situation like on North Division by the Foundry, for example, just where you have these high concentrations of residences, where you have pickups, delivery, Uber, all those sort of things. That space was attractive for people to pull in, and the cones weren't tight enough for us to prohibit them to do that. They would just kind of sneak in between. There were some initial confusion, you'll note through some of these notes, with especially the early deployments. We had to go back and make some corrections to signage. Some people were confused by kind of the construction feel of the deployment, since we used kind of barrels and cones and barricades. There was some active construction near some of the deployments. So, for example, on South Main by the old DTE building between Packard and William, they were tearing that building down during this deployment. So that led to some kind of complications for how the Healthy Street interacted with that active construction zone. And then, on sections of Packard and other areas, we just saw cars kind of encroaching into that coned off area when perhaps they shouldn't have, parking or using that buffered bike lane as a sort of turning lane. But overall, the general observation is that, these represented a safety improvement. One of the things that I have liked to try to frame the conversation is, there may have been some impact to motorists, and we'll get to that in a minute. But if you think about, that impact was typically concentrated in the afternoon PM peak area or afternoon rush hour, whereas the protection of the protected bike lane with the cones was 24 hours a day, right? So if you had a chance to bike on Main Street, or especially East Packard, if you've ever biked on East Packard without the Healthy Streets and then biked on it with it, it was a night and day different experience. And so, I think those are the sort of experiential differences between what it was without the Healthy Street and what it was with the Healthy Street. And that sentiment is reflected in this next point, this next category of COVID-19 responses. You'll see that overwhelmingly those who used the Healthy Street as a bicyclist or pedestrian responded very favorably to them. So 76% of pilot project users said the projects contributed to their ability to maintain physical distancing, which ultimately was the purpose of those Healthy Streets deployments. We did collect bicycle and pedestrian data on these as well, just to see if they actually got used. One of the things I will note is we don't always have pre-installation count data, because perhaps there was no facility to count, right? So if you think about East Packard again, while it's not completely unheard of that someone would be biking on a travel lane on East Packard, they would be few and far between. And for us to actually capture someone at the right time and right place would probably be difficult. So since many of these deployments didn't have a facility before, there was no pre-data, but you'll see that, they did get used, right? So on Miller, you had 153 cyclists. On Division, you have nearly doubling from 95 a day to 189 per day. South Main, there were 92 per day on the dates that were counted. State North U, 98. We didn't collect that small segment of Packard between State and Hill, but that segment of Packard gets a fair number of bicycle usage. And then the last one on East Packard, 111 bicyclists were using it per location per day. So, it's fairly notable that, we did attract people to those facilities with these deployments. The last two under bicycle connectivity and access really talk about how many people used the facility per the respondents and what their general experience was. And you'll see that generally the user experience was very positive. On the low end, 73%, and on the high end, 81%. So for survey people who completed the survey and identified themselves as having used these facilities on a bicycle, they responded very positively to them. Traffic volumes. Now, this was, in full disclosure, this was an issue that was raised as a concern from many members of the community about, the congestion that was created by the healthy streets. When we went out and we did observations, when they first went up, as with any construction zone or any change public right of way, there's always kind of an adjustment period. So, the early days in the deployment did see some backups, but we tried to mitigate those as much as possible. Overall, the traffic volumes, really not a lot to mention there. You see the traffic volumes are included for informational purposes. But in terms of the backups, so if we look at the backup for the morning rush hour, we saw very little impact. This is a trend we've been seeing kind of across the city, that the morning rush hour, or what we call the AM peak, has pretty much dissipated during COVID. Now, some of that is probably ticking back up, but we, aside from a few instances on maybe Division and State North U, there really was no impact in the morning. In the afternoon rush hour, the PM peak, there was kind of a mixed bag. For the most part, half of the deployments on Miller, Catherine, South Main, State North U, and Packard did not see any observed backups. Now, I will say, compared to normal conditions, right? So at the 5 p.m. or 5:15 p.m., yeah, there are some cars that are queued up. It's not necessarily a free flow condition, but what we were looking at is how many traffic signal cycles could a car get through, or did they have to wait for to clear the intersection? And it was almost always one cycle, even at PM peak. There were instances where we made some adjustments. So if you think about East Packard, for example, the deployment, especially if you're eastbound on East Packard, that went from Eisenhower all the way to Platt. Well, there was some intersection capacity concern that was raised by the public, and so we actually pulled back the cones away from the Platt intersection to allow the vehicles to kind of queue up two lanes to get through the intersection, and that pretty much alleviated all the traffic concerns that we observed in that PM peak. Luke Liu, who was on the call earlier, he also made some signal timing adjustments that helped. And so we really tried to do the best we could to mitigate any of those PM peak backups, because this was a concern that we had heard quite a bit about. Then the last one is turning behaviors. This is another one where, again, there were some kind of bad behaviors that were observed. Some folks were, not observing kind of the limitations of the healthy streets properly. They were kind of encroaching into those turn areas. We did hear a fairly startling story of a bus that was stopped to pick up a passenger in a car zipping around the bus in the healthy street coned off area to go around the bus. Well, that's worrisome for a lot of reasons, especially if a passenger is getting on or off the bus and that car is whipping around the right side of the bus. We did, adjust cones and make sure, or try to mitigate that from happening again. But one of the limitations of kind of those temporary treatments with barrels and cones is, someone can always just go back out right after we go out there and slide it back to where they want it, as opposed to where we want it. So, all in all, I think, staff's assessment is looking at the mandate that council gave us. The Healthy Streets did accomplish what we were set out to do. So, arguably, or the main focus was to provide a safe passageway for bicyclists and pedestrians in the public rights of way. Again, the data seems to suggest that's true because A, people were using it, B, people responded to it favorably, and C, we did not see upticks in safety concerns. I think one of the things that's going to be interesting is, as traffic comes back to normal, especially, I know we're all anxious about getting the vaccine and kind of trying to restore normalcy. But what does that mean for traffic? Should we, assume that every car that was on the road before will come back? Well, maybe we don't want that that's not actually our stated policy, right? We have a 820 carbon neutrality plan that suggests that we actually are trying to shift people outside of vehicles. And so trying to figure out what a future deployment would be is kind of still up in the air. And that's one of the things, this is included in your packet tonight as a business item, because we would love to get some direction from the Transportation Commission in terms of what you might like to see on a future Healthy Streets deployment. So, Madam Chair, that was me talking a lot. I will pause here and allow folks to ask me any questions they wish.
Thank you so much, Raymond. This was great. I was thrilled to see the Healthy Streets pilot happen, and I'm really pleased with the data that you all have collected on it, and the results of the study have been really helpful. So great. You just stopped screen share, so we're going to go do the thing now, where for folks with questions or comments, raise your hand and I will call on people. Commissioner Hadamaki.
Thank you. I love the deployment. We particularly loved Division and Main Street, South Main. One comment on the Division deployment, because the temporary bike lane was using the right lane of a one-way, I did notice, a number of times cars turning onto Division from Packard were pretty confused and would, kind of stop because they thought because they're forced to go in the left lane, they thought they were going against the flow of traffic, not realizing all lanes go north. And that leads me to my other comment or question is the fact that these are all temporary deployments, introduced some issues as you discussed. I guess I'm interested in the future, not really, or not being temporary. I mean, not being just a seasonal, throw up some construction barrels. What's the appetite and the ability to make permanent many or all of these or more such features?
Yeah, and Commissioner Hadamaki, thank you for that question. I think ultimately that's a great discussion item for this commission to see what perhaps their recommendation would be. Admittedly, it was a mixed bag with the deployment. Some were better received than others. So, Division was probably the one where we got the most positive feedback. And then the Broadway Bridge and East Packard were the ones that we probably got the most negative feedback. As you may recall, even subsequently in, I think it was the October 5th City Council meeting, that we actually got direction to end certain portions of those Healthy Streets based on some of the feedback we had been hearing from the community, in particular Broadway, East Packard, and parts of South Main. So that's kind of why I think, any direction or any preference that this commission has is helpful, so then it will inform staff and inform City Council on, what sort of direction we should go in the future with a deployment like this, whether they're permanent, whether we want to try something again temporary in the spring, if we want to look at different areas. All that I think is appropriate to hear from you all on.
Commissioner Hadamaki, I'll let you do your follow-up, and then Commissioner Boland.
Okay, thanks. I think we're all really encouraged and impressed by the positive feedback that we see in the surveys. And I just wanted to point out that I think there's room for people to be even happier if these were made permanent with a little bit more thought and, not having to deal with confusion and construction barrels and that kind of thing. I think there's room for these to be received even more positively by the people that use them and drivers if there was less confusion. So I just want to put out my interest in pushing forward the idea that these could be made permanent.
So I was curious about if you had any insight into the difference between the installations that met some speed reduction goals and the ones that, were like 1 mile per hour less. Is there some secret sauce there in terms of how to make them effective in reducing traffic speeds?
Yeah, you know, Commissioner Mullen, I'd be hesitant to venture a guess on that, but I'll do it anyway.
Why not?
I think part of it might just be the, you know, how wide your bell curve is, right? So like when you look at a road like East Packard, the amount of traffic that was on East Packard, especially during the pandemic, probably encouraged some additional speed, right? Because there are less cars, and so people are able to go a little faster on that corridor. So when we take away that outer lane, you take away some of that capacity for people to you know, fly through the corridor. You also have a sort of pace car effect that if someone is actually following the speed limit, they set, you know, the pace for others. And so I think that's why you might see some of that variation. Whereas, you know, if we're looking at, for example, State and North U, right? You know, that's a very heavy pedestrian area. There's a lot of kind of activity. There probably isn't a lot of high speeds through there as is. And so to see even a 1 mile per hour, you know, decrease, for example, at that location, it's maybe not earth shattering, but it's kind of notable that you still see that it had this sort of traffic calming effect, even though, you know, speeds aren't high out there to begin with.
Thanks.
I have a question. So we've talked a fair bit about the way the temporariness of these installations were one of the limitations, and it led to confusion. I'm curious, knowing what you know now and what you've seen now, how would you go about doing these differently? If you got the directive to say, do it again, you know, but better, what does that look like?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we tried to do, and maybe this is a shame on us, we tried to do these as cost effectively as possible. And I think while that we achieved some efficiencies with doing it that way, we also ran into some problems. So one of the first things we did was we piggybacked off of an existing contract. So the resurfacing contract was the contractor we used. They were already obligated under another contract to do other work. And so when we kind of squeezed this into their existing contract, we, in the early days, got some, we had some issues with performance that we had to kind of address. I think that would be one of the first things would be is if we did deploy this and it was done through a contractor, it might make sense to do it, you know, as an independent contract. So that way we can hold them accountable to that contract. The other thing that I think we would probably have to do is we'd have to address the movability, if that's a word, of whatever device is put out there. The cones, the barrels, the barricades, you know, if people brushed up against them in a vehicle, either knowingly or unknowingly, you know, it required maintenance. People were deliberately going out and moving these things on a daily basis, and we, you know, it was like cat and mouse, and we would go back out and switch them. And so I think looking at different sort of opportunities to put out there, whether that's delineators, whether that's a more jersey barrier style that's a little less movable, whether it's better pavement markings. You know, if we had kind of more time and a little bit more budget, we would have done it differently, and we would do it differently on a new deployment to make sure that we eliminate some of that confusion and we eliminate some of that constant shifting that was happening. That was kind of a very difficult thing to keep up with.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I know that the neighborhood slow streets aren't included in this report. I'm wondering if that's going to be a separate discussion item for us to sort of bring those up for, like, to consider for another year, or if we would have to initiate that if we wanted to bring those forward.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on it, but at your all's direction, if you would like to have a discussion on that, I'm happy to kind of frame, you know, how things went, what our process was that we used, and you can give us some direction on that as well. So I'm happy to help facilitate that discussion if you want to have that.
Yeah, I think that would be great to plan for at some point next year, earlier rather than later. Councilmember Briggs.
Thanks. Great to see all that information. And I know that was it was sort of a rocky project in many ways. So it's good to see some of the good outcomes. I think something that would be useful to have in there, especially around the crash data, is what did crashes look like on streets, maybe somewhat comparable streets without healthy streets, where we've seen a reduction. Is that reduction in crashes specific to those places with installations, or are we seeing, fewer crashes everywhere? Because I think a lot of the criticisms about this and about this data is that it's COVID data. It doesn't mean much, so it's challenge. That'll be challenging. In addition to some of the pieces that you mentioned around maybe how things might happen differently in the future, even with like temporary installations, I guess I would encourage us to think very much that people have a visceral and negative reaction to construction barrels. And so having those on the street, and then people have the visceral and some people have visceral and negative reactions to bicyclists. So you just put them together and it's a perfect storm. And so to the degree that we can change the coloring, change the types of tools that are used on the pavement, even for temporary treatments, I think that would go a long way. I think using the DDA has done a particularly good job of this on some of the downtown healthy street stuff, of having some signage that's really clear that it's healthy streets, and thinking about what happened in Chelsea this summer with the Chelsea High School colors being used at the pop-up crosswalks, I think made it feel kind of fun and different and exciting. I think we need to kind of lead people towards that feeling of, oh, this is something I'm supposed to be excited about when I see it. Because the reality is, as much as I love seeing installations like this, council, I was just coming on, and I can't believe how many emails I received about stuff when I wasn't even on council yet. So I know that they got hit pretty hard with from folks who are driving about what this felt like, and it's hard for people not to respond to that kind of feedback. So I think I think we've learned a lot of lessons out of this, hopefully, to how to approach, give staff the time and the resources to be able to do this differently in the future, I think, if we move forward. But I know from the user perspective, they were really great additions to our community.
Sorry, I was muted. Commissioner Felt.
I would also speak for making things more permanent. I think that having expectations, well, people don't like change. And so the less things change, the better. But also the expectations of where will bicyclists and pedestrians be and how will they act? The more we can improve that, the better. So just as a small example, I was quite shocked the other day to see a guy with a stroller walking against traffic in the bicycle advisory lanes on 7th, which seemed like really scary to me, especially since the stroller comes first. And that's not what the bicycle advisory lanes are built for. But just it seems like pedestrians are kind of popping up. They don't really know what use they have of the roads now, because we've given a little bit and then taken it back. And I think that that's a much more dangerous tactic than having something more permanent. So I do hope that we can commit to something and stick with it, even if it's to say, until November, we'll be doing it this way or whatever. We need to have clear expectations of how people are going to behave, even though they're not going to behave that way. But it does help. That's it.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Commissioner Parsons.
Thank you. And Raymond, thank you very much for the update and stuff. And I just want to sort of jump off on where Linda Diane and Erica Briggs just were, and just point out when we see people in the roadway instead of on the sidewalk, it means that the roadway's safer for them than the sidewalk. So I think it's also areas that we can point to that the pedestrian or bicycle infrastructure isn't working because they don't know where to go. You know, it's not so much that it's temporary, it's that we're not designing systems so that people understand them sort of on an intuitive level. The other thing that I want to say, though, that I'm really stoked about, and Raymond, you asked a question where to go with this in the future, what to do with the data and all that kind of thing. For me, this data is really cool because it shows you what works and what doesn't. So for me, even doing this project is a win-win. We know it works and we know it doesn't, and let's figure out how to move forward. So for me, looking at the data, where did the safe streets make, or healthy streets make complete sense? Cool, let's figure out how to make them more permanent. Where did they not work? That's fine. East Packard, I live on it. I understand why it quote unquote didn't work, even though it perfectly did, but there's backlash. That's fine. If we can't do it in the street, let's figure out an alternative. But now we know, you know, we know how to move forward. So anyway, super positive about all this. And I really look forward to how to do it in the future. If there were one thing I were to say, Raymond, when it comes to moving forward with the Healthy Streets Initiative, is how do we connect things? We know it works, so let's connect it to what also works. But when we find those gaps that don't connect, let's figure out alternatives. You know, I'm super stoked on this. I think we should do it again, sooner the better. You know, come spring, let's figure out some more, personally. So thank you for this.
And we do have a possible resolution on the table to formally recommend that we bring this back next year. I wanted to make one more comment, which is just that I think a really a valuable piece of information from this is that the demand is there. Even during a time when the population of Ann Arbor was hollowed out, even during a time when total number of commutes were dramatically lower, people were just straight up not leaving their houses. We had over 100 people a day using some of these facilities. And I can only imagine what those numbers would look like if they were more visibly for cyclists and so people knew they could ride in them, if people have more places that they need to go. It's sometimes if you build it, they will come is false. And I think this is not one of those times. It's clear that we built it and people were using it. And like, yeah, some drivers were mad about it. That's fine with me. So, and I'm saying it on TV. So that's like, I think this is great. So if no one else has any questions or comments at this moment, I'm gonna move us to the resolution. Oh, Commissioner Hadamaki, did I see?
Yeah, thanks. I skimmed through a lot of the emails, a couple hundred pages, I think, of emails that you guys received in the report. And there was, I guess, like a common refrain of concern about cut through traffic, I think particularly in the East Packard deployment. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to either, you know, address that and if there were, you could confirm, or maybe, I don't know, I imagine this is going to come up in as we consider these next year and future years. There's going to be people that talk about that, judging by the number of emails that were written. And also, as a quick aside, some of the deployments, there were lanes in each direction, like on South Main and East Packard. There was 2 lanes that were closed off, whereas like on Division, there was 1 lane with 2-way bicycle traffic in that 1 lane. Was there a rhyme or reason? I know on Division it seemed to work really well, and if it would make everything more palatable to the population at large to have 1 lane as opposed to 2. Just a thought. I wasn't sure how you guys decided which lanes to close. Open,
Sure. So,
sorry, open to bicyclists, closed to cars.
yeah. Let me address your second question first. So I think the rhyme or reason behind what treatment we used, whether we used a sort of bi-directional contraflow cycle track like you had on Division, right, with 2 lanes going, or 2 directions on the same bicycle facility, was really a function of how does it tie into another facility and what kind of room do we have to put it in and what does the road configuration look like. So Division worked by taking kind of the outside lane. Division is already a one-way street. It already had a bike facility on parts of it. So the question is, you know, what kind of value add can we get out of the healthy street? And so that's why we added the kind of contraflow direction, or, you know, the southbound direction on Division. On Main and East Packard, the situation is such that that outside lane, you know, if you take East Packard is probably the easiest to think of. You know, as East Packard transitions to Packard, when you hit Eisenhower, there's already a bike lane on both sides. So this doesn't require a crossover effect, where, you know, you have to cross the streams to get over to a bike facility if it's only located on one side of the road. And quite frankly, like on East Packard in particular, closing that outside lane was the easiest deployment, right? Because it wouldn't require pavement markings. It didn't require any substantial reconfiguration of the roadway aside from just closing that outside lane. The same rationale was used for Main Street because, you know, you have that outside lane. Now, Main Street did suffer a little bit, and the report mentions this. When you had a vehicle wanting to make a left-hand turn and you didn't have the benefit of that center turn lane like you have on East Packard, it would back up the cars behind it, right? And so there was a lot of kind of intermittent sort of congestion where, you know, a car like Hill is a good example, right? A car was waiting to turn left on Hill. There's no turn lane there. And so it's just a single lane now. There's nowhere for the cars to get around. This was a location, for example, where we saw people constantly moving the barrels to allow for like a little slip lane on the right to get around a car that would be turning left on Hill. So that's kind of the, you know, the rationale behind it. And again, I think, you know, staff is kind of, we are of the impression that a more traditional road diet would have been a better deployment on Main Street, where we did a 3-lane configuration where we took away one lane in each direction, center turn lane, but that would have required restriping, right? Because we'd have to strip off all the existing pavement markings, restripe a center turn lane. And that pavement condition on South Main, for those of you that may recall, about 2 years ago, there was a thin surface that was put on. We talked to the project manager on that, and if we were to strip those pavement markings off, it would probably deteriorate the asphalt pretty badly. So those were some of the constraints. I know this is getting way too detailed, so I'll move on to your second question, which I've now forgotten because I've rambled on too long.
Just if you wanted a chance to address cut through traffic through neighborhoods and the inevitable complaints that are probably going to come up the next time this is considered.
Yeah, that is definitely something we'll have to address. You know, I think in a perfect world, the way this could have worked would be where we had a road diet or a lane reconfiguration or a healthy street on a major road, that we would do some complementary slow streets on the adjacent neighborhoods. And we did have that in some instances, but again, the neighborhood slow streets were driven solely by what we heard from residents on that street. That was the direction we were given. And so, and I know this is a point of frustration for some of you that we sometimes don't take a network approach. It's very kind of localized, right? So this street may want it, this street doesn't ask for it, so then all the traffic moves over to this street. That's kind of what we saw happen. And I think we'd have to think through that a little bit better. Maybe be more proactive at a staff level to say, you know, if we're putting this in, we suggest this to be a neighborhood slow street, or, you know, send out flyers to the neighbors to say, hey, we're doing this. Do you want this complimentary treatment? I mean, there are several different ways we could maybe think through that, but it is definitely something that was observed to, you know, varying degrees, right? Some experiences or some places experienced it more than others. But I don't doubt that, you know, that was an experience that people who lived on those streets saw. Another little interesting anecdote is many of those streets are already in our traffic calming program. So they already have a cut through issue, assuming that that's why they're in the traffic calming queue to begin with. So, when we look at, what is it, Rosedale and some of those off of East Packard, they're in the queue. So that condition, that problem already exists, but it probably was exacerbated by the healthy street.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So I'm gonna try to move us along since we are now past 9. Based on the conversation that we've just had, I'm gonna give us a resolution to consider. Kayla, it's slightly different than the one that was in the draft because I'm trying to include the things we've talked about today. And then we can see if we have a motion for that and move forward. So my question, is there a motion to recommend that City Council pursue Healthy Streets implementation and necessary budget allocations for spring 2021 to include neighborhood streets in the Healthy Streets implementation and to identify locations where previous Healthy Streets reconfigurations should be made permanent? So does anyone have it's a big motion. Anyone? Do I need to come up with a different motion? Commissioner Parsons?
Is it too soon to defer to Councilmember Briggs on this point?
Well, I think the goal.
I don't know for sure, but it sounds great to me.
Right. I think the goal is like, this is what we want. This is what the Transportation Commission wants. If this is what we want, that's what we can tell council to do. They can listen to us or not. As we know, they're very happy not to listen to us.
Oh, yeah.
So we should say what we want. If this isn't what we want, we can rephrase.
How about we do in the spirit of motion and allow the chair and Councilmember Briggs and Kayla to tweak the language within? I don't know. I'm fine going with existing, but if others.
Commissioner Felt, did you have a?
Yeah, could you just read the last sentence again?
Yep. It was all one very long sentence. So there's so to recommend
part about permanents.
Sorry, right. So to identify locations where previous Healthy Streets reconfigurations should be made permanent. So at this point, we're just saying identify them. Or that's how I put it. So getting them to actually become permanent would be a couple more steps, presumably.
Thank you.
We can change that language. If we get a motion, then we can refine it. Commissioner Hadmacky, are you moving?
Sorry, yes, I'm just moving. I wasn't sure if you wanted comments or moving. I'm just moving it.
Let's move it and then we can discuss it.
I'll second it.
Okay, great. So moved by Commissioner Hadmacky, second by Commissioner Boland. Discussion.
So by permanent, we mean year round?
Yeah. I'm taking from our discussion today, I'm taking that to mean that for at least some of these reconfigurations that we saw, we should find a way to make those reconfigurations permanent, or some version of them, knowing that there needs to be some refinement. It's probably going to end up having to be looped into resurfacing plans, like all of the. Mm-hmm. I was trying not to get too much into the logistics of it, but just the idea that some of these could probably become permanent, and we should specifically encourage council to consider that.
Mm-hmm. And so the only other thing that I worried about a bit, the one thing that I didn't like about Healthy Streets last year was I thought it got started too late. And so you say spring, but I wonder if we should put a month in there.
March? That's
March.
Starts, right? That's a friendly amendment as far as I'm concerned. We could say as soon as possible. Maybe
yeah.
The languages.
Maybe April is better than March just because of our weather.
It's still winter here in March, but lately the thaws have been coming earlier and earlier.
Yeah.
Councilmember Briggs.
I have a couple hesitations. And I think Transportation Commission should do what Transportation Commission wants to do. I think that's the point. But so I have a question. for Mr. Hess. How does staff feel after having done these sort of pilot projects during COVID? Do you feel that you have the data at this point that supports making any of these treatments permanent?
That's a loaded question.
It is loaded. I need you to be able to say yes to that one of those.
Well, I think, the thing that I struggle with on a almost daily basis is we, as a community, we have supported things like the A20 plan. We've supported things, well, there's been ongoing support for the transportation plan. All of those plans, documents, and policy statements call for change. Hard stop. So I don't know how we're going to achieve things if we don't change them, right? I mean, this reminds me of kind of that classical definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So we can't achieve these stated policy goals if we don't make changes, right? Because if we don't make changes, we're going to be exactly where we are now, status quo. So to me, the bigger question is which values should drive the decision? When a lot of the criticism came in on Healthy Streets that this was having an adverse impact to traffic and motor vehicles, that was never our charge. That was never the stated purpose of the program. So again, did the program accomplish what it was directed to accomplish? I would say yes. Was it flawless? No, I won't say it wasn't flawless. There were some hiccups, there were some things that could have been done better, and if we were to do it again, we would do it better. But I'm also not going to sit here and say it will have no impact to anybody, because I can't, right? I mean, we know it's going to, if we take away a lane of travel, it's going to have impacts. And so to me, that's the hard question. And this is the question we seem to grapple with as a community of we really want to do these progressive things, but those trade-offs are hard, right? And we're at that point now. I've joked with my colleagues that they did all the easy stuff before I came, and now the hard stuff is still on the table. Now, that's not true, obviously. There's been hard stuff all along, but yeah, we're at the point where if we're going to make these kind of monumental shifts as identified in our policy plans, we need to start figuring out which of those trade-offs we're willing to accept. So I know I did a great job of not answering your question, but I think ultimately if the value is mode shift, in other words, getting people out of cars and into more sustainable forms of transportation, if that's our driving purpose, then yes, I think the Healthy Streets kind of demonstrates that if you build it, they will come. Infrastructure is destiny. If our guiding principles are safety, well, another analysis that you don't see in here is just the sheer, when you take away that outside lane, for example, you're reducing the number of conflict points, right, for a pedestrian. So if you're a pedestrian crossing East Packard, for example, that one less travel lane, or South Main, think of crossing South Main at Hoover or Keach, where you have these crosswalks where there's no, flasher. Taking away that outside lane minimizes the ability that you'll get hit by a car by half, right? So these are the sort of things, like if we want to achieve safety, if we want to achieve mode shift, if we want to do these things, we have to start doing some of these hard projects. They're not going to come without trade-offs, but if we agree as a community that the safety benefit and the kind of sustainability benefits outweigh the impacts to motorists, then that's the direction we should go to implement these things.
Okay, I think you answered my question. I mean, the piece that I wanted to make sure is that this is obviously a policy direction of which way the city, the community council wants to go. But if you feel like you have the data to be able to support, because obviously the goal of this was physical distancing, which is a little bit, different from the mode share shift goal. But if we have that data to be able to move forward with making an informed decision for permanent installations, I think that personally, I'm supportive of that. If we don't, if we feel like we still we would benefit as a community to recognizing that change is difficult and that another temporary installation, learning, the hard lessons that we did this year, doing it better, building more community support, getting more robust data as we move out of COVID, hopefully, would be beneficial. Then that's the route I would support, even doing it again on these exact same roadways. Then I think that's a smarter move to make. But I guess I think you answered my question, that you've got the data. The other piece is, realistically, our budget is going in the sewer this coming year. And so finding money to be able to make strong, good permanent installations, I think is going to be challenging for the city administrator and transportation department to do. So that's the other second hesitation on this.
So what I'm going to do right now is share my screen so we can have further discussion. It will be hard for me to call on people, so just jump in. Oh, I can't share the screen.
I need to make you a co-host. Okay. Just a minute.
So that everyone can see the text of the resolution. I know it can be hard to process just from hearing it. I know it helps me to see these things. So
you should now be able to share screen.
Great. And hopefully I'm sharing the right thing. Yes. So this is the motion as I have drafted it. And I'll give folks a second to read that, and with attention to the verbs. And then we can sort of continue discussion and see if we need to amend it in any way before we move forward. Oh, we were already going to do, I think it's friendly, so I'm going to change this to March/April. How's that? And that way, who knows what the weather's going to bring. Let's see, can I set this again?
And Madam Chair, if I may, typically for what we call frost laws, we tend to schedule mid-November through mid-April. You're right, there are seasonal variations and that changes year to year, but typically that's when we redeploy like those in-road gateway treatment signs and things like that. So,
oh, right, perfect. We'll align it with all of that then. So that makes sense. So any further comments or discussion on this?
This is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that it seems like the fourth to last word, should be made permanent, could be made permanent, which would even take more power out of it. Molly, sorry, but it would also just, there doesn't have to be an assessment. It's just staff saying these worked pretty well, if that makes sense.
Okay. I had originally written that down as shall, so should was weaker, but we can.
I know. But I don't know if that's the hang-up word, then I'm fine going with could, or should be investigated to be made permanent. Anything that's.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, so we're asking about identifying the locations as opposed to actually doing anything about them.
Yeah, we're already asking to identify, and so it's not should be made permanent. It's could be made permanent. It's, okay. But whatever. Sorry, maybe that's just
I don't know all of the Roberts rules when it comes to friendly amendments, but I'm good with just editing, with just making that change, and someone tell me if I'm doing it really wrong. Commissioner Hadamaki, I think you also were about to say something.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm honestly more excited about this as a road diet initiative in general, and I wonder if people see healthy streets as a COVID only necessity, whereas road diets as part of 820 and the new transportation plan is something that's more attractive long term. And particularly, does this imply that if we do want to encourage a section of road to be considered for a road diet, that it has to go through a healthy streets reconfiguration trial first? I just don't want to tie, well, I just want to be careful about tying the possibility for road diets in general to the Healthy Streets program, which might be seen by some as a purely COVID response program anyway. I don't know if that makes much sense, but
It does. I hear what you're saying. I mean, the sense I've gotten from other cities is that the whatever they called their COVID-related street openings / closings were really popular, and there's various ways that cities are looking at sort of continuing that kind of initiative, a sort of like fair weather street opening that goes like the sort of name stays, but it goes beyond being related to COVID. I don't share your concern about forcing road diets through this process. I could be wrong, but I think we already have a very clear process in place for road diets, and I don't think that this would interfere with that process.
I have a comment when there's, so I'm a little bit worried with this complex multi-clause sentence that it's a little bit too overwhelming. And so I wonder if perhaps a friendly amendment would be to have a period after 2021 and then say something like, further, this should include neighborhood streets in the implementation period. We strongly recommend identifying locations where previous healthy streets reconfiguration could be made permanent, something like that. So there's like 3 separate things. And, worst case council could say, well, we don't like including the neighborhood streets, but we'll do the other stuff, but make it a little bit more clear that they're separable recommendations as opposed to, we want them to do it all, but they wouldn't necessarily have to.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, go ahead, Kayla.
Sorry, I just want to say, related to that, I can do some follow-up with the clerk's office to confirm format. I think if you all agree on the content, like another option that comes to mind to me is this could be a very brief document that says that the Transportation Commission's recommendations related to healthy streets implementation are, and then bullet point, 1, 2, 3, whatever those are. And maybe it gets passed along to council that way. I would just probably want to check with the clerk's office on what's the best format for these to be received in. I think it's fine the way Julie's proposed modifying the sentence, but I do think we can work out the sentence structure and format later on as long as the content is.
Okay, great. That's helpful. So are we feeling in agreement on the content of the motion as it is and trust that we will get it phrased correctly afterwards? I'm gonna stop sharing the screen so I can see everyone again. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay, so we're gonna vote. All in favor, I'm gonna read this motion again, of a motion to recommend that City Council pursue healthy streets implementation and necessary budget allocations for April 2021. Further, to include neighborhood streets in the implementation. We strongly recommend identifying locations where previous healthy streets reconfigurations could be made permanent. All in favor, raise your hand. All opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, motion passes unanimously. Thank you all for working through this together. Awesome. We are now going to maybe try and speed through the last few items on our agenda. The first of which is that we are going to invite Kayla Coleman to present the draft Transportation Commission 2021 work plan.
Thanks, Molly. I think we can cover this very quickly. The work plan was provided in the agenda packet. The work plan can continue to be a living document that we can adjust at any time throughout the year. This provides a guide to city staff and the commission chair and co-chair as we do agenda setting for each month. So it's not critical that we carry out this discussion in full tonight. We can bring it back to the January agenda. We can also handle it by email. So if there are any pressing comments or questions, or if you want me to pull up the work plan right now for us to look at, I'm happy to do that. I also think in the interest of time, if you want to move along, we can do that.
Commissioner Felt.
I think once the 7th Street Committee is done with its work, there won't be any active committees. And so I think we've done some of our best work in committees, and I would encourage us to think about larger chunks of work that can be done with that process and what committees we want to form. I think so far I've drafted all of them. And so I'm also encouraging other people to step into that process and consult with Molly and Julie about what might be best moving forward. And just the only general concept that I have I'm thinking about is sort of post-COVID reality in transportation, and that we may want to be a little bit forward-thinking in that regard. If buses are indeed endangered, and if our fundamental, peak hours of operation are changed and that kind of thing, is transportation going to look really, really different coming on? And so as a visionary kind of a thing to bring up to City Council, and also sort of have the staff be more thinking more, it's after 9 o'clock, I can't speak. To have the staff be including in the conversations. That's just the one idea that I have, but it's a fairly nebulous concept at this point. Nothing as solid as coming up with recommendations and that kind of thing, but just what do we need to be aware of in the next year? I invite other people to consider things like that.
I think that's a great idea. I like that idea. I also, after this conversation, wonder if we might want to have a Healthy Streets Committee to dig into the data a little more and help continue to guide the vision as we look to doing it again next year. So great. Those are things that we can talk about. Commissioner Hall.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I was going to mention is I'm wondering if we'll have an agenda item for the RTA, particularly as they talk about bringing back their Detroit to D2A2 service, which right now I don't know when that's going to be. I'm thinking it might be like next summer or fall. And yeah, then they're also potential working on a plan to do a millage at some point, like would be 2022 at this point. And thinking RTA should perhaps be considered it for an agenda item.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that's a good one. Okay, so other thoughts about work plan, feel free to share them by email and we can return to this in January. Thank you. And thank you, Commissioner Felt, for that reminder about committees. It's I haven't had a lot of experience with committees since I've been on the commission, but I do see the way that they're a really useful way to work to get stuff done. So next we have our staff report and updates. So we received a staff report providing project updates with agenda materials, and it's all available on Legistar, and we're going to get a quick review of the highlights from Commissioner Hess.
Yes, very good. Can you hear me? Okay, I switched over to a mic. So, all right, I will try to do this in 2 minutes. Allen Creek berm opening, it's complete. There's a virtual grand opening video online. Annual sidewalk repair program complete. Annual street resurfacing project complete. William Street improvements, the hardened centerline treatments were removed for the winter, but that is a strategy identified in the draft transportation plan, so we might see more of those next year. People-friendly streets, construction will wrap up for First Street for the season, and then it will continue in the summer of 2021. And then Ashley Street is scheduled to begin in spring 2021 as well. There is a focus group underway right now for People-Friendly Streets Part 2, which is, as the name implies, kind of the next iteration of the DDA's People-Friendly Streets program. Scioto Church we talked about with the commission last month. That was approved by City Council to remove the on-street parking in favor of the buffered bike lane. Sidewalk gaps are identified on page 2. So you have Barton Drive, Boardwalk, Jackson, Manchester, Scioto Church, Stimson, and Yost. Getty's Road water main, it's just a water main replacement, no traffic changes, but there will be closures that will affect traffic. Similarly, bridge maintenance, again, no changes to traffic circulation patterns, but there will be closures that will require detours. At your all's request, I did add a paragraph about advisory bike lanes. I know it was a little late, I apologize, but we have created a website that has information on it as well that we're directing people to for those. So if you have feedback on that, by all means, please share that with us. We talked a lot about healthy streets. I won't go over that. There's a little bit of discussion about the electric vehicle readiness ordinance from the Office of Sustainability and Innovation. They're working on a requirement that new buildings and major building retrofits should have EV charging in their parking space, and that ordinance is expected to go to council. I don't know if it's scheduled for the Monday meeting, but soon. According to this, it's supposed to go Monday. And then there are some electric vehicle fast chargers installations that are happening downtown at the Ann Street lot. That was funded through a grant rebate. Streetlight implementation, 33 streetlights were installed so far in 2020, and almost 1,200 outages have been addressed by DTE. Traffic calming program, you heard about Glenwood tonight. Transportation plan updates. This is kind of going through the motions. You all made a recommendation last month. It's then went to the Planning Commission on December 1st. It's going to the City Council in January. And again, that will release the draft document to the adjacent communities for consultation. And then lastly, there is a memo discussing winter maintenance. At the very bottom, there's a link included there. So if you want to just get a feel for how we plow, it's detailed in the memo. I may have gone over 2 minutes. I'm sorry.
That was pretty tight though. All right, thank you. Next up, we have liaison reports. So any commissioners who specifically serve as liaison to another body or organization are invited to provide brief reports and updates. Commissioner Hall.
Yeah, so yeah, we just had the Commission on Disability Issues meeting, and we actually voted on our recommendation regarding the crosswalk laws, which is based on what we passed earlier this year. Essentially, I took the same language and added a few things and credited the Transportation Commission. And yeah, just so we passed that. I know we had some delays, and then we wanted to wait for the crash data. And then, yeah, that was the one big thing I wanted to mention. Just yeah, I also sit on the RTA's Citizens Advisory Committee, and they mentioned actually the stuff about, yeah, the D2A2 that they're probably holding off on that as far as starting that until there's actually demand for it. And yeah, that would maybe be in the summer fall time frame. It just other.
Okay.
All right.
Other liaison reports. Yes, Councilmember Briggs.
I think Mr. Hess mentioned, he mentioned almost everything that I wanted to report on. The one thing that I think this body might be interested in is, and I suspect it'll be sent along. I don't think it has already. There's a memo from Sam Schwartz that is included in the council packet. I don't know if it's posted on Legistar yet, but it will be, I assume, by Friday, about the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure review. And it also has a little section reiterating that our crosswalk ordinance is consistent with regional and national best practice. So thought that would be something of interest for everybody to read here.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. All right, so then moving on now to commissioner communications. This is a chance for any commissioners to provide reports or updates. Okay, and I'm not seeing any. Call for agenda items. So we did already just go over the work plan, but if anyone has any agenda items for our next meeting in January, you can briefly share those now. We can also handle agenda items over email. Okay, no agenda items. So if there are no objections, I'm going to pause and look around for any objections. Okay, we're ready to adjourn. So this meeting is adjourned. Thanks everyone so much.